I'm lacking one.
All right. I hope you were able to work through some of the answers on your table work. I'm pretty sure it was called table work when I was in grade school, when you showed up and there was a worksheet already there while you're waiting for everybody to come. So quick trivia, keep track of your points because the table with the most points wins. And I'm sure all of you are getting like more points than I even know are available on this thing. But we're going to run through this lightning speed. So get your pens out to mark your answers, okay? Lightning speed through this. Number one, what are the 6 primary texts that we've been looking at that address same-sex eroticism?
Genesis, Leviticus, Romans, 1 Corinthians, and 1 Timothy.
Yes, Genesis 9, nice. Genesis 19, Leviticus 18:22, Leviticus 20:13, Romans 1:26-27, and broader context, 1 Corinthians 6:9, and 1 Timothy 1:9-10. That is from week 1's notes. You can find those answers on the website. Okay, what is the sin of Sodom according to the story? Name at least 2 that seem to be primary in the story, and according to the other references in the Bible, name at least 2. What are they?
Hospitality.
Inhospitality of strangers, which is a grave sin, and
Sexual violence.
sexual violence. That's right. Those are the 2 that are obvious there in the story. What are some of the others that the rest of the biblical context makes connections with?
Greed.
Greed? Pride, gluttony, lavish living, not aiding the poor, sexual immorality, indulging in sex with angels. Those are all other, I know, Jude 7, look it up. All right, or go back and listen to week 2 on the website. Number 3, how many times is the word tova, translated abomination or detestable, used in the Old Testament? And how many refer to things other than same-sex acts? What are those numbers? 117 times it's used, and how many times refer to something else? 111 of the 117 times. Bonus confession time. What are 3 abominable sins that you've committed in the last year? Anybody?
Eating pork.
Shrimp, pork, shellfish, bacon,
Polyester cotton.
polyester cotton,
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Trimming my beard.
trimming your beard. Anybody plant a little garden this year? Sowed more than 1 seed in the same garden?
Oh, heck yeah.
Yeah, you guys are sinners. It's a good thing you're at church. We'll have an altar call later. Gender complementarity, what does it mean?
Allows for procreation.
What's
Allows for procreation.
allows for procreation. It is involved with procreation, but there's more to it than that. Physical compatibility, that's a part of it. Broadly, it means God's original design for human sexuality in creation is defined by the opposite and complementary nature of male and female. And when we talk specifically about anatomical complementarity, which is sort of a subcategory, we're talking specifically about genitals and how they complement one another. So that's the primary traditional argument against the support of same-sex relationships in the church. It's the leading point in conversation with Romans 1. What are the 3 primary texts used? Romans 1, 26 and 28. That's the primary text with supporting from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Okay, keep going. What is the first and only problem that God sees with God's own creation prior to the fall?
Man is alone.
The man is alone. So God says over and over in Genesis 1, it is good, it is good, it is good, it is good. And the very first thing God says, it is not good that the human is alone. There's no suitable helper for the human, for the Adam. All right. Number 6, what are the 3 layers of connotations for categories of natural, unnatural, used by Paul and other Jewish, Christian, and pagan writers of his day? Procreation, or the biological meaning of sex. What's naturally for it is procreation. Yeah, that's one.
According to one's inclination.
One's internal natural inclination, one's personal disposition, that's another. And we've got questions about those that we're going to get to later. And the third?
Social order.
The social order. What's normal in the social order and in his patriarchal world, what he sees naturally, what would be thought of natural and unnatural. Anytime a man takes the role of a woman, it is degrading to the man because it's less than. So those are the three layers of meanings. What three passages other than Romans 1 where Paul uses that word or category? Did anybody get any of those? This is a tricky one. You have to really study. You have your green handout.
Romans 2.
Romans 2:14. It's often translated as instate, but it's the same Greek word.
Ephesians 2.
Ephesians 2:3.
And 1 Corinthians 11.
1 Corinthians 11. Good job, Chuck. You might be on your way to winning. What group of people is Paul referring to in Romans 1:18 through 32?
Gentiles.
The Gentiles at large. What are the three primary contexts in which same-sex eroticism was practiced in the Greco-Roman, aka Gentile world of Paul's day?
Master-slave relationship.
Master-slave,
Temple prostitution.
temple prostitution,
Student-teacher.
student-teacher. That's right. Okay. Moving on the backside, I don't know, maybe yours isn't back. I don't know. What's the primary criticism of same-sex eroticism that's shared by pagan, Jewish, and Christian writers in the ancient world?
Insatiableness.
Insatiable lust. That's right. An out-of-control sexuality, an over-the-top sexual appetite. That's right. That's how it's seen and criticized and understood because of the context in which it's understood to exist in their world. Okay, so what do scholars mean then when they say homosexuality was not a word or a concept in the ancient world?
It wasn't a concept in the ancient world.
It wasn't a concept, yes. What do we mean by that?
The ancient world thought of actions not as an innate orientation or condition.
Right, so they would describe actions, but they had no word for an innate orientation of sexuality. It was not a concept. So someone could not, quote, be a homosexual. That was not a category of thought. People were thought to be capable of both attraction and involved in both heterosexual and homosexual activity at the same time in the same period of their life. That's what they saw happening in the Greco-Roman context that Paul is addressing. So, homosexuality is a modern word and concept. There is no Greek word that translates as that word. And in our time, it has a range of meanings, including sexual orientation, identity, and activity. All right, number next, the last one, 1 Corinthians 6:9, 1 Timothy 1:10. Paul invents a new word that has often been translated as homosexual or homosexuality or sodomite or homosexual offenders or all kinds of other words. What are some other equally adequate, or you might say inadequate, translations of the very same word because it's a new word where we don't really know what it means, but from other contexts in which it begins to get used later after Paul? Anybody remember?
Sexual trafficking.
Sex trafficking, yes. Ellie, you're on your way to being my star pupil now. Sexual exploiters, rapists, sexual predators, pimps, those are all equally as good translations of those same words. It would be nice if our biblical writers would at least put a footnote there, wouldn't it? They do on many words where they're not sure. In Genesis, I didn't mention this, another comparison. Most words we know what they mean because they're so widely used. There's another example in Genesis where it describes Leah versus Rachel, and Leah's eyes are, this Hebrew word, we have no idea what it means. Some translators say beautiful, some say ugly, some say weak, some say soft. We don't know whether it was a positive or negative word. That happens sometimes when you're pulling from ancient translations. Most words, though, we do have a very strong awareness of what they mean, but there's always some we don't. Okay, so there's your review. Anybody got total? Yeah.
You left off on a question.
I did. Wow, what question?
What does budget duke mean?
What does budget duke mean? Anybody remember?
Curse word.
It's a curse word for Christians in a conservative Christian college. All right. Points. Anybody have, how many points do you have? -2. We've got, oh, come on, you guys got it. All right, come to a table with some people. That's okay. Points, anybody? Points?
2 that we.
2 points?
2 that we counted.
2 that you counted? Does anybody have more than 2 points? Does anybody, how many do you have, Chuck?
I didn't add it up.
Too many to count, you're the winner! The Lord is my shepherd. Bookmarks, there you go, all right. Yay. If you want to contest their winning, there can be a recount. You're welcome to go and steal their bookmarks. Church office gets all kinds of interesting freebies sent our way.
Chris, were you
Yes.
aware of the difference between the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm?
No, is it the 23rd Psalm?
This is the Lord's Prayer. No, no Lord is my shepherd.
Yeah, I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, can you help me pass these around? All right, we are going to spend most of the morning digging into the questions that were submitted to you. And I wrote out all the questions and a lengthy answer to all the questions and realized I don't have enough time to answer every single question. So there are a couple questions that I had to delete for the morning, but they will be answered on the handout on our website. We just don't have time for them, but I'm getting to what I think are the main questions that were being asked. In fact, my whole first page you don't get to see. Sorry, you'll have to go to the website notes later. So these are what you'll see, each of those numbered questions in quotations there are the questions that you submitted. I made up none of these questions. These were the questions submitted by you all. And these are then my notes on how I would answer them. And let me just acknowledge that different people would nuance these answers differently, but this is how I would answer them as I have come to study and understand it as best as I can. Also, in light of the 3 books we have over here, I just want to remind us of where I'm drawing much of my resource from. The Baptist ethics professor who wrote on the traditional side and changed his mind, why he changed his mind. This is the best book to have easy access to understanding this conversation. These are short chapters. He writes very clear and concisely and graciously towards people on both sides because he's been on both sides and he understands that complexity. So if you're wanting to get into this and review it, this is the best book to sort of review what we've talked about. Bible, Gender, and Sexuality, James Brownson. This is the best deep academic. Here's where the current conversation is, and let's explore the back and forth arguments a little more deep. This is really, really good in dealing with gender complementarity as well as the ancient sexual world, as well as trying to deal with some sexual ethics at large. But this is a really, really excellent book. He's probably one of the leading scholars dealing with this. Matthew Vine's God and the Gay Christian. This is going to give you similar kinds of information as David Gushee, but it comes more in the form of personal narrative. So if you want to read about a person who grew up as a conservative Christian in the Presbyterian Church in Wichita and began wrestling with his sexuality in college and deeply committed to following Christ, but trying to wrestle with these texts. This is his story and his scholarship. He was at Harvard at the time. He's, I think, younger than I am. But this has a little bit of narrative with it. All good resources if you're interested in those. So those were the 3 primary texts from which I have been drawing, and that in my own other random study. Okay, so in Leviticus, we had a couple questions about Leviticus. One we're not going to get to today, but the central question was some clarity around abomination and why something was abomination. So this question was about if male same-sex eroticism was an abomination, was it only an abomination because of the waste of seed? And we've talked about that several different times. What about it? Some of the scholars talk about that word tova as being translated as a boundary marker, as this isn't something we do, this is something that other people do. Was it also an abomination because this was something that other people did, not us? And it's sort of a both and answer. If you look in the text, in the Leviticus passages, what's really interesting is right above Leviticus, the text in Leviticus 18, the very verse right next to it talks about not sacrificing children to gods like they do to the god Molech. So it's specifically talking about the ritual worship practices of their neighbors. We don't sacrifice children. We don't allow men to have sex with men in the way that they have had sex with women. So it seems very connected there. And you see the same thing in Leviticus 20 in the broader context. They're dealing with the worshiping practices of other groups around them and how they're defining themselves against them. So I think maybe there's actually a multiple layered, interconnected reason of why it was considered an abomination. Here's the logic that might have been at work, sort of the underlying moral logic. It wastes sacred semen, therefore it's a cultic worship practice that we won't engage in, even though it's how our neighbors practice their religion. It's probably kind of both. They're interconnected, if that makes sense. Yes, and I'm not going to have time to do a lot of question and answers with these, but if it's a quick clarification. Okay.
So the other people sacrificed children, and so we're assuming that they also had homosexual sex?
We know that in other traditions, that part of their, like we talked about in the Greco-Roman context where there was temple prostitution, and sometimes that also happened in the ancient Hebrew world and some of their rituals. So yes. Okay. Questions related to natural and unnatural, and this is like, again, where the heart of the conversation is, and so this is really important that we spend some time processing and understanding this. So I'm going to try to allow for some conversation around this. So here was the question, and this was a great question, I thought, concerning the personal disposition meaning of natural and unnatural. Paul claims that he doesn't do what God wants him to do. And he does do what he doesn't want to do in Romans 7. Doesn't that undermine the whole idea of natural and unnatural as talking about a personal disposition? And also, what about persons addicted to pedophilia, to child abuse, to pornography? Is this a justification for all these? That's such a good and important question of clarification, because when we talk about natural and unnatural, and Paul's talking about an inner disposition, it's easy to sound like we're saying Paul says whatever your natural disposition is okay. That's actually the opposite of how Paul uses the word natural and unnatural. So let me first, though, just mention in Romans 7, Paul doesn't use the word natural and unnatural. And it's really important to realize that when he uses that word, natural and unnatural, he's drawing from a philosophical category of his day, a philosophical category that got developed by the Stoics, and that other Jewish authors began to use in their own ethical traditions. So when they're talking about natural and unnatural, it's a philosophical category that has underlying meanings. Now, what it doesn't mean is what is naturally the greater good. Okay? So Paul is not saying what is naturally good in terms of this ideal out there when he talks about natural and unnatural as the personal disposition. In fact, he uses it in the opposite way. So remember, one of our usages of Paul comes from Ephesians 2, chapter 2, verse 3. He uses the category of natural or by nature to say that evil will flow from a person who is by nature evil. Okay, so he's not saying that whatever your natural disposition is the good, but it is what is by nature in that person is evil if they are evil. In Romans 2, what is by nature in the good person, their instinct will flow from good. So what we need to recognize is this is a Greek category. Many Jewish writers in his time were using it. It's not about an abstract ideal of what's naturally good. Now, that said, Paul, I think, like everyone else in his day, is assuming that everyone has a, quote, natural inner disposition towards heterosexuality. I think Paul has that assumption working. He doesn't have that category, but I think that's his assumption. And they exchange that natural desire that is in them for additional sexual outlets that we've talked about. Again, he's not talking about a concept of sexual orientation. He's not saying they exchange one orientation for another orientation, but they're pursuing additional sexual outlets other than the natural one with their wives, the one that they would have naturally desired. So here would be one way of translating Paul's phrase. This is my own translation pulling from this idea. In the same way, the men abandoned their natural desire for sex with a woman and burned in their desire for other additional sexual outlets, men with men. These were, because that's the context of what he sees happening. Remember, these are people who are engaged in multiple sexual outlets, not changing one orientation for another orientation mostly. So the point is, though, that whole conversation is that when Paul's using the word natural and unnatural, they are not synonyms for straight and gay. We often, I think, in our context, with our categories, have read that into natural and unnatural. They aren't synonyms for straight and gay. Any questions about that? Because it's really nuanced, and I know that's kind of hard to get our mind around. There's 3 layers of meaning for natural. One of them is a personal disposition, by the way that Paul tends to use it. So he's assuming everyone has a disposition towards opposite sex attraction. And they're not only satisfied in that, but one additional sexual. And so they're exchanging that own for more outlets that were available in the Greco-Roman context.
Do you think that it would be fair to translate that more as like promiscuity?
I think so, yeah. Would a better translation be, or at least an idea behind it, that he's criticizing the promiscuity of the day. And that's actually what you see pagan ethics and writers criticizing. So it's not that all the Greco-Roman ethics thought that this was okay, but what's commonly criticized is the gluttonous behavior, the promiscuity, the overabundance. And that seems to be what Paul's also criticizing. That was the common criticism for that behavior. Yeah.
What's the basis of his assumption of heterosexuality?
So again, Paul does not have categories of heterosexual and homosexual, but when Paul looks out at his world, what he knows from his context, what's most normal, what normal in terms of what's most common, are opposite sex. So he assumes, just like I think probably a lot of us at some point in our life assumed everybody has an innate desire for opposite sex attraction. What science is now telling us is no, that's actually not true. We've been wrong about that. There is a percentage of our population, 2 to 4%, that have an innate attraction towards the same sex and cannot change that. They can't then have an attraction for the opposite sex. So Paul's making, I think, his worldview assumes that. And the Greco-Roman context assumes that people could be involved in both at the same time. There wasn't just one orientation or the other. Other questions about that? Okay. I don't remember all what I deleted off of yours. Is there a point B, the biological meaning of procreation in that? Okay. If the only natural reason for sex is procreation, why do women have orgasms, which is unnecessary for procreation? A great question. This is, again, has to do with the Catholic and Protestant different understandings of sex. So in the Catholic Church, they still connect the primary meaning to sex as procreation, which is why contraceptive devices and things are not okay. They're considered immoral in the Catholic tradition at large. Not all Catholic people agree with that, but that's what the tradition says. The Protestant tradition, though, has had a fundamentally different tradition around it. They haven't taught that procreation is the primary reason. Instead, they've emphasized that the bonding nature is the primary reason for sex. The one flesh, the new kinship that's created in the sexual, so the intimacy that's created, the new kinship bond that's created, that's its primary purpose for sex, not procreation. And that's been pretty consistent in the Protestant tradition. So we obviously don't agree, but in Paul's world, that was the opinion. Okay, number 3. Are male homosexual acts considered, quote, shameful, in Romans 1:27, as a reference to the shameful acts, only for the passive partner, but not the active penetrating partner? Or is it, quote, shameful for both? And you might remember we talked about how a male who was treated like a woman, it was this in an honor-shame culture, there was a lot of shame in that. That's part of what was condemned about it. So Paul's, he uses the word shame, and there is this idea that shame is being now imposed upon the passive partner. Okay, so by the boy or the student, or by the temple prostitute, or by the slave, that they are being shamed. And so what you don't have, and I mentioned this I think last week, you don't have someone who switches back and forth between those roles. It's always the higher position in society as the active partner, the lower position in society as the passive partner, and they don't swap back and forth is the common practice from what we can tell. So it is a shaming thing because they're being forced to take on the female role. And remember, there's nothing more shameful in that culture than for a man to be treated or reduced as a woman. And that's why in 1 Corinthians, Paul mentions it is unnatural for a man to have long hair. It is degrading because that is a man taking on what would be considered a lesser than position. Now, that being said, here's an important clarification. The active partner was still widely condemned in the Jewish, pagan, and Christian writings, but not because they were receiving shame. Again, it's because of their excessive, gluttonous nature of their sexual exploration. Remember, they're writing about people who are involved in multiple sexual partners in the same time period. Often these are married men. So, here's kind of how this all fits together. While the active dominant male was not being shamed, he was widely condemned as having out of control lust, and he was also committing a shameful act upon another person. Does that make sense? How that shame and honor works? So they could both still be condemned. Any questions about that? Yeah.
I would just say from a heterosexual perspective in that world, rape was a property crime that destroyed the value of the woman, not the man. And that there was shame upon female prostitutes, not so much the men that visited them.
That's exactly right. So that's really well said. In that world, rape was something that destroyed the property value. So if a woman was raped, the problem is like what we see happening in John 9, right? Only the woman was caught in adultery, is pulled out there. It's her value has been destroyed, and that's the problem. But the man who committed that is not the one that's the problem. That's kind of what you're saying, right? That it's about this property value. And you made another really good point. There was part of that. I forgot where it went.
There was shame for women who were prostitutes, but not so much for the men who visited.
Yeah, so men who visited prostitutes were not shamed, but the women who were prostitutes were shamed. This has been part of the problem with our own laws in our culture, so we have been shifting laws from incarcerating prostitutes themselves to the Johns who hire them because they're the ones who are actually the real problem, right? We've begun to recognize the prostitutes are actually more often the victims and the overall world they're caught in. But in that context, yeah, there wasn't shame for those who visited the prostitutes.
As really in the Judah and Tamar story.
Yes, I was thinking about Judah and Tamar. Great insight. What is that, Genesis 27?
Sure.
Something like that. Look it up.
Somewhere in the middle.
Any other questions about that? Okay. That sort of leaves all of the particular questions about the passages we looked at. Here's questions about passages that we did not address that I got. And these are also part of the overall larger cultural conversation and somewhat in the scholarly conversation. But very good and helpful questions. When the Bible uses marriage imagery for the relationship between Christ and the church, it always assumes a male and female paradigm. For example, Revelations 21:2, I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Or Ephesians 5:25, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. These are metaphors for Christ and the church, which always appear as a husband-wife paradigm, modeling the male-female paradigm for marriage. How does this fit into our conversation? It's a really good question. And this is where we come back to two very important words. I can't remember what your notes say, but descriptive versus prescriptive. When we are reading the Bible, it is important to remember that there is a fundamental difference between reading passages as descriptive and reading them as prescriptive. The Bible's authors are almost always describing and drawing from the world around them, from what they see as normal. They are descriptive from their world. That doesn't mean that they should always be read as prescribing what is true in all times, in all places, for all people. Okay, so that's an important paradigm what we talked about. So traditionalist scholars will say yes, that these metaphors for Christ and the church, they should be read as prescriptive. They are prescriptive. They reinforce that. Revisionists such as myself, would say, no, they're actually more descriptive of the paradigms that they have to draw from. They're descriptive of the world they have around them. When reading the Bible, I would suggest that it's generally better to assume what's being described at large, not just in this context, but at large. It's generally better to assume that it is descriptive, not prescriptive. Because if we start reading lots of the Bible as prescriptive, we'll go back to owning slaves. We'll go back to women being treated as less than and made silent in the church. We'll go back to promoting polygamy. So, and those are just a few examples. There's many, many, many examples. They're drawing from the culture, the world around them, and they're using that to then have conversation, dialogue, tell stories. They're often describing what is normal in terms of what they see happening most commonly, but they shouldn't necessarily be read as prescriptive, saying this is normative for all times and all places. So that's one part of this answer. The other part is, I think it's really important to realize that these are metaphors that Paul is using. They are metaphors to teach us about Christ and the church. They're teaching us about mutuality, covenant commitment relationship between Christ and the church. They're not trying to answer questions, can marriage be between two people of the same sex? That's not a question they're even asking. It's not the point of the text. It's not the point of the letter. So we're missing the point when we make that the point. And on a little side note, let's just say for a second I'm wrong, okay? And that they should be read more as prescriptive. If these passages are primarily paradigmatic, if they're a little bit more literal, and they're supposed to be teaching us about the very nature of marriage and not the nature of the church, they actually could be used to support same-sex marriage because all men in the church are now described as brides. Which is really fascinating to think about, right? If all men who are part of the church, Peter, who is the head of the church, right, are now described as brides. So you see how this can get kind of convoluted along the way. I think that it's actually not a very good, it's not good to read those passages and say they're teaching us about marriage. They're trying to teach it. They're drawing metaphors from the world to teach us about Christ and the church. Okay, I'm going to keep going for time's sake. The gospel and other New Testament writers besides Paul, Jesus, and others. I had 3 similar kinds of questions that came in over the course of our 4 weeks. Why does Jesus or John, Peter, or James not address the issue? Wasn't it even more common in their time? Another question. Is there any speculation as to why the Gospels never mention the issue? You keep mentioning culture at the time. Another one. I've heard it said that Jesus never mentioned homosexuality in the New Testament because, quote, at the time, there was no question of whether or not it was right or wrong. Thoughts? Yes, I have lots of thoughts. A long answer for this question. Yes, Jesus never mentions it. And here are some of my conclusions from the broader biblical context. Again, same-sex eroticism was not prominent in the Jewish context the way it was in the Greco-Roman context. And Paul, remember, is the apostle to the Gentiles. He is the apostle who is writing to in about the Greco-Roman context. So in other words, it's really important for us to remember when we're reading the epistles, we are reading letters that were written from one person to a community, to real people and real places in a particular location addressing specific questions in those contexts, which is a really important thing to keep in mind about how then do we apply them universally, right? We need to be careful about that and mindful always that he's addressing particular contexts and people. So Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles, not John, Peter, or James, or even Jesus, who is all of them are primarily addressing the Jewish context, not the Greco-Roman context. So I think that's partially why they don't address this. It was prominent in Greco-Roman life. It was not a prominent, accepted cultural practice in the Jewish world. Nevertheless, and I think this is really important, undoubtedly, same-sex eroticism still took place in hidden corners in Jewish life, just like it has always taken place in hidden corners in the life of the church for the last 2,000 years. So it wasn't culturally prominent. It wasn't really a question for them, but certainly it still happened. Remember, this idea of orientation was not a paradigm until the 18th century. It was just assumed that all people were attracted to the opposite sex. So just like Paul doesn't answer questions that he's not asking. Jesus doesn't really answer questions nobody's asking. I do think, though, and this is where I get into a broader reading of Jesus and the Gospels at large. I think it's worth noting that, like I said, it still likely took place in hidden corners, but it's not a sin that Jesus apparently thinks is worth addressing. It's not like he would have never heard of it. He would have certainly been aware of it, and he certainly doesn't shy away from hard issues. But he doesn't focus on it the way the church does. He doesn't address it, which suggests that maybe we have missed the boat here. So here's my question to you. This is not a rhetorical question. Who does Jesus consistently criticize throughout all 4 of the Gospels?
Church leadership,
The Pharisees,
the lawyers,
the religious leaders
Teacher.
of the law, the teachers of the law, the religious leaders of his own community, right? We can sort of put scribes, Pharisees, lawyers. They're all the religious leaders of his own community. Those are the ones he consistently is critiquing, that he seems to be the most concerned about. And what does he critique them for and about? Hypocrisy,
false teaching.
false teaching. You have my little list there. Judging, creating categories of clean and unclean that exclude certain people. Right? That was a common problem he's constantly addressing. Making the external issues the central issues, the law and obedience law, rather than the internal of the heart. And so he says the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you, Pharisees and chief priests and elders. And he criticizes them for not caring about those who are marginalized. The least of these, listed in Matthew 25, the children, the bleeding woman, the lepers, etc. That seems to be, if you look at Jesus' ethic, he has a big concern about these categories of clean and unclean and how people are then excluded because of them. So my conclusion, this is my conclusion, and you can disagree with me. In fact, this is a conclusion I heard someone else in this room say that I have drawn from, and they can take credit for it if they'd like, but I won't put them out. If I'm wrong, I'd rather apologize to Jesus for welcoming too many people than excluding people because they are unclean sinners, quote. I'm placing my bets on Jesus' radical welcome that he demonstrates over and over and over and over again. Because you know, I've said before, I've been on both sides of this. So I was either wrong before or I'm wrong now. So Jesus can be mad at me one way or the other, right? But that's where I'm placing my bets, is on Jesus' radical welcome. Because I would rather have to apologize for being too welcoming than for being too excluding. Just based on Jesus. Thoughts about that, reflections on that, questions about that.
It's putting the judging on us, and we were told not to judge.
Yeah. I am quickly running out of time. So I'm going to keep going, but that's just kind of where I am, and I've tried to, and you're going to hear more of my own convictions as we move through this, but again, this is me answering your questions as best as I can. That's how I think about Jesus in relation to this conversation, though. So some questions about science and ethics at large. One of those questions I will have the resource group address because it's a scientific question when I'm not qualified to answer it. So here's a question. Aren't immoral acts among heterosexuals condemned just as much as between homosexuals? Yes, and that's my conviction. That's kind of been my point. It's not necessarily the same-sex nature of the relationship that I think the biblical witness is concerned about. I think the biblical witness at large is rather concerned about the proper place of sexual relationships within a covenanted, committed, loving, lifelong relationship. That seems to be what the biblical witness overall is concerned about. This is why I've said that in Romans and 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, I think what Paul is addressing, the situations he has in mind, are the same things that all of us would still condemn. He's not addressing our question today, as I'm able to understand it. It's also why I said the disclaimer that I had at the beginning, that I don't think all same-sex relationships are healthy and holy. Just like I don't think all heterosexual relationships are healthy and holy. We need a better sexual ethics. And I do, though, think the Bible speaks negatively about same-sex eroticism because of the paradigm that it understands it in and addresses, but it's not addressing the questions that we have in light of the scientific research we now have and the relationships we have with people. So yes, the Bible condemns immoral sexuality all the time. Most of the time it's addressing heterosexual realities. Okay, number 7, similar kinds of question, but a fundamentally important question. I do believe that some humans are born with, quote, desires for members of the same gender. What does God expect people to do who fall into this category? Live alone? Deny their true feelings? Try to change themselves? And how are we as Christians supposed to treat people who are in same-sex relationships? I have a personal friend who's gay who used to be Christian. Because of how some of Christians have treated him and how he thinks the Bible views him, he has turned away from God. I have some friends like this as well. This is actually I would say this question here is the fundamental reason we're having this conversation. I've had multiple people ask me, why are we having this conversation? This is the reason. How does the church's teaching and our practice invite people into deeper life with Christ or push people away from deeper life with Christ? I was going to show us a video that I think I'm running out of time to show. Yeah, you know what, we're going to watch anyway. Okay, so this is Julie. You guys might remember a couple weeks ago we heard from Julie. She grew up in Dallas in the church, memorizing Philippians as a middle schooler. She, in high school, began to wrestle with same-sex orientation, went to reparative therapy, became a spokesperson for reparative therapy, saying, I'm trusting God with my sexuality, God's going to change me. Spoke all over the nation as a 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old person about it, but kept wrestling and couldn't change and tried to date guys and it wouldn't work. And finally she had to say to them, you know, it's not working and I can't keep speaking for you. This doesn't work. So then she was committed to being a celibate woman for the rest of her life. And she went to work for Wheaton College as a celibate gay person to minister to their gay students. Wheaton being a conservative college, obviously. Many of their alumni had major problems with her. She got pushed out within the first year. And she just continued to struggle with it and said, you know what, this isn't really working either. I don't think this is what God has for me. And so now she's speaking to a group of people who identify as part of the LGBTQIA plus community, who are also Christians. And this is the end of that same speech we heard earlier, and her saying, here's why I'm still a Christian after all of this. Because I think so many of people in that community have had a hard time. So this is kind of her testimony about why I am still a Christian. Can you, Terry, grab the lights for me real quick?
I want to close by talking for a few minutes about why I'm still a Christian. What I think Christianity, why I think it's so freaking amazing. And I want to name just how hard it is to hold on to a faith where, like I said earlier, where people who have claimed the name of Jesus and claimed the name of God have been the source of most of the pain and rejection and heartache we've experienced in our lives. It's really hard, and I'll just be really honest, like many of my LGBT friends have walked away from Christian communities altogether, and I don't blame them. I get it. And there have been many, many times where I've just wanted to be like, I am done. All my life, I've tried my whole life to be good enough for you guys. I tried to become straight all those years. I tried to pray and work and do and the makeup and do it all to try to become... And it wasn't enough. And then I was committed to lifelong celibacy if that's what I needed to do. And it wasn't enough. And I've watched these communities continually let down LGBT people made in the image of God. I'm pushing for legislation that continues to push my trans friends out, vilifying them in despicable ways that I'm not even going to talk about up here. It's just breaks my heart and it's maddening. It's not okay. And I've wanted to be like, I'm tired of trying to be like gracious and conciliatory, and I just like my nephew with his vegetables, I want to be done. When the very people, the very bodies that Jesus came to liberate are trampled upon by people in his name, it's not okay. But here's why I'm not. The very self-righteousness that led so many of these people to cast people like us out, I know it lives in me. I know it does. I feel it. The same sort of judgmental spirit lives in me. It looks different now, but I wake up with it every day. I wake up with fears of other people that are my other. They're all in me too, and I can come up with all kinds of justifications for my lack of grace. But y'all, I want love. I want love. And I know that I can't muster that up on my own. I can't meditate my way into seeing the humanity of people who have been the source of so much pain and anguish for me and my friends. I can't get there on my own. I need a God who's bigger than me and bigger than you. A God who holds all things together. You and me and the people that we can't understand, that we struggle to love, that holds all of it together and works out something inside of us that we can't do on our own. I need that. I need a God who can help me to begin the process of forgiveness. And we could say like, oh, forgiveness is just another burden on the backs of the oppressed. But forgiveness is also what heals us. And I want to forgive. I want to love. I want to see humanity. Even if those people won't see the humanity in us. I want to love. I'm a Christian because I know loss and brokenness and heartache. And I need a Savior who knows those things too. I'm a Christian not just because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, but because of the life of Jesus. I'm a Christian not just because of what might happen after we die. I'm a Christian because of the restoration God can bring to a hurting world now, while we're here, as we continue to seek to live in the Spirit of Jesus Christ. I'm a Christian because I need a Savior like this one that Francis Spufford describes, one of my favorite authors in this book, Unapologetic. He says, and Jesus is never disgusted. He never says that anything, anyone, is too dirty to be touched, that anyone is too lost to be found. Even in situations where there seem to be no grounds for human hope, he will not agree that hope is gone beyond recall. Wreckage may be written into the logic of the world, but he will not agree that it is all there is. He says, more can be mended than you fear. Far more can be mended than you know. I need a lot to be mended, y'all. We need a lot to be mended. We need a lot to be mended individually, and we need a lot to be mended as a society. And the promise of Jesus is that even the grief we ourselves cause can be mended.
So that's one person's testimony about why she's still committed to being a Christian. But as she said, it's understandable why people who have a particular orientation have a really hard time still being a Christian. And then there's some of those who are my friends that I've worked with and spoken with along the way. So here's just a few responses to this question, though, that I received. That I want to just speak through briefly. And this kind of goes back to week 1 and some things that we said. Here's what we do know. Here's what we know for sure. Anywhere from 2 to 4% of all people have an unchosen innate sexual orientation towards people of the same sex. They cannot choose otherwise. That's what we know scientifically speaking. It's what we know from people's experience and scientific studies. We also know there are LGBTQ plus Christians, Christians who are ideal Christians, Christians who embody the fruit of the Spirit, who are in same-sex lifelong relationships. We know this. I know this. I've met people. They are in many of our CBF and ABC churches. We also know that the church's option for these individuals has been really 3 things. 1, remain celibate. 2, change through reparative therapy or other means. Or 3, choose to be in an opposite relationship anyway, even though you're not attracted to that person. Those have been really the options for those individuals. The fruit of the church's teachings that we have seen has been intense psychological damage for these individuals. Reparative therapy doesn't work. Even the leaders of that movement have come out. The people that Julie used to work for said Julie's right. It doesn't work. They apologized and shut it down. besides reparative therapy, the intense psychological damage that comes from being told by your community, your family, this deep rejection within you. Spiritual damage that comes from people. The church's teaching has tended to push people away from Christ, not toward Christ. I think that's a pretty profound thing, because people who are part of this community have, in one way or another, been led to think that God has made a mistake in creating them. Or they tried to change but couldn't change. God must have made a mistake. Or they are fundamentally evil in a way that most people are not. There's something different and evil about them. We also know that forced celibacy is not God's intention. We see that from the very beginning in Genesis 2. It's not good for the human to be alone. This is what God says, the one thing that's not good in creation. And forced celibacy contradicts Paul's teaching about celibacy in 1 Corinthians 7. He says, yeah, it'd be great if everybody was like me, but if you burn with passion, it's really better for you to get married. Forced celibacy goes against his advice. Physical damage, so psychological, spiritual damage, physical damage. There's significant statistical data that show an increase in suicide rates and homelessness by LGBTQ youth who have been rejected by their communities, by their families, by their religious communities. The higher level of that rejection they've experienced, the greater level of suicide and homelessness. These are real tragedies that have been some of the fruit of the church's teaching. I can't think of many positive fruits that have come out of the church's teaching. I'm sure traditional scholars would offer me some. But from my experience and those that I've interacted with, I can't think of many positive ones. So what are the other options? Change course. Re-examine. Not just change course because it's culturally convenient. And let me be really clear about that. Because the culture is changing course. That's not what I'm talking about, but I am talking about re-examining the very essence of the gospel and the trajectory of the Bible. You remember I preached about how to do biblical interpretation last May for 4 Sundays. You can go back and read those or listen to them on our website if you want. But here's kind of an important paradigm, Gentile inclusion in the early church. This was a huge controversy. I think we think it was a simple thing because we read Paul and think, yeah, it was obvious. But this was a huge controversy. I think it parallels this conversation parallels the church's big, deep struggling over Gentile inclusion, because they decided Gentiles don't have to be circumcised. In other words, and I use this word intentionally, they did not have to change their identity. That's what circumcision was. It was about changing your identity from Gentile to Jewish. They did not have to change their identity by addressing a concern that centered around their genitals. So this has become my biblical narrative and paradigm for understanding what's happening in the church today. As I look at the biblical trajectory, it's a trajectory towards inclusion. So we hear in Galatians 3:27, that often quoted verse, because all traditions recognize how important this verse is. There's no longer Jew or Greek, there's no longer slave or free, there's no longer male or female. All those categories of identity that divide us, we are all one in Christ. It's this also, I think, the very same change, of course, that the church made around race and slavery. And hear this, the texts that support slavery in the New Testament are now read as descriptive, not prescriptive, and seen as counter to the overall trajectory of the Bible and the gospel. Same thing with women. The texts that were read that suggest women are inferior to men are now read as descriptive, not prescriptive, and seen as counter to the overall trajectory of the gospel and the Bible. And that's not changed from not all that long ago. So I'm in a camp that says, this is just me. This is where I am. I'm not speaking on behalf of Dayspring at large. I'm just speaking as your pastor and who I am. I am in a camp that says we need to welcome people of all sexual orientations and all gender identities fully into the life of the church, affirming that they too are created in the image of God, and invite them into the same kind of loving, committed covenant relationships as the, quote, sexual majority. This is not an anything goes ethic, and I've had that question asked of me several times, and so I want to be really clear about this. This is not an anything goes ethics. I'm advocating for equal ethics and equal expectations for all Christians in their sexual lives. Do you hear that difference? I'm not advocating for an anything goes ethic. I'm advocating for an equal ethic. And here's where I am on that. I think our sexuality is most healthy and fully expressed within healthy, loving, committed, covenant relationships of mutual love and care, the ideal of marriage. Then there's one other question about Dayspring's conversation that I'm going to just go through real quick because we're about out of time. Does our church, Dayspring, support LGBTQ plus persons? Well, that's an interesting question because it depends on what support means, I think, and probably a different person. So I'm not sure what this question means by support, but here's maybe a few clarifications. Can people of all sexual orientations and gender identities join Dayspring? Sure. According to our bylaws, if you are baptized, if you are a follower of Jesus, you can join Dayspring. To not allow certain categories of people would actually require a change in our bylaws. So right now, yes, and they have been in the past, in our history. Does our church have an official statement of support? No. We don't make statements about most things. We are a diverse people. That's what we mean when we talk about being open in heart and mind in our mission statement. We don't tend to make congregational statements around any topic that people have all sorts of different opinions on. So no, we don't have any kind of statement. Do I, as a pastor, support the full inclusion of people? Yes, and I've already said that. But in a Baptist church, pastors don't dictate policy, and I don't dictate opinions. Part of what I love about being a Baptist, one of my favorite things of our heritage, is freedom of conscience. I cannot dictate to you, I'm not the Pope, what to think or believe. And I want to be really clear about that. What I'm saying up here is not dictating. I'm offering you what I think and believe. And I know not everybody will think and believe like me, and I still love you and want to be in church with you and want to be in community with you. There's probably other things that we would disagree with besides this particular conversation. That's okay. So I don't get to dictate. And I don't think everyone's going to have the same opinion anytime soon. Not at the end of this calendar year, probably not in the next 5 years. So one other note about the leadership team and the resource group. The resource group was not created to force everyone to have the same perspective, but to help us talk together about how we will be the church when we know not everyone thinks the same. Help us think better, help us have dialogue and conversation, but ultimately, how do we be the church together in this time, in this place? That's what the resource group is about. I'm 2 minutes over. So I would love to have conversation with you. But I'm not going to open up right now for conversation, but please know that I would love to know what you're thinking, feeling, what you're having a hard time with, what you're struggling with in this conversation. Know that I'm not here to criticize or condemn any of this, because I understand, like I said, I've wrestled with this for a long time. I've been on both sides of this. But I would love to know where you are and how you're processing and what you're thinking. What's hard for you about this conversation, what's important to you about this conversation. If you want to talk to me, please let me know. Send me an email, and I'd love to meet with you sometime. Thank you so much for your participation, and let's go and worship together.